Thanks, Shannon.
Thanks.
Hello and good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you to this fourth and final book launch to celebrate the inauguration of Beyond Criticism editions published by Boiler House Press. My name is Katharine Craik and I'm Professor of Early Modern Literature at Oxford Brookes University. And I'm here as one of the three commissioning editors of Beyond Criticism, along with Tommy Carshan and Simon Palfrey. And tonight we'll be celebrating the publication of Textual Non Sense by Robert Crawford. Robert's book speaks very directly to the main aim of the Beyond Criticism series, which is really to discover new forms for new thinking about literature and literary studies. The series is really keen to foster a literary criticism that is itself more literary, borrowing some of the spontaneity and experiment of creative writing and finding out how these qualities might reveal something new about literary tradition and about canonicity. All of our authors in the Beyond Criticism series are seeking to break down some of the barriers between scholarship on the one hand and imagination on the other. It seems to us that to think critically is to think creatively. To think creatively is to think critically. And all of our books work with these ideas in different ways, as we've seen in recent weeks at the previous launches of Macbeth, The Sick List and A Shaken Bible. But Textual Non Sense makes a particularly important intervention in this respect, putting forward the suggestion that humour is one of the things that has been lost from literary criticism. So before I introduce our speakers for this evening, I wanted to mention that the series is open to new submissions. You can find full details on our website, which is simply beyondcriticism.net. And if you go onto the website, you can click through to the Boiler House Press website, where you can buy a copy of this week's book for £10. And you can also buy the full series list, all 4 books for the bargain price of £35. And you can also follow us on Twitter at Beyond Crit. Tonight, our colleague at Boiler House Press, Shannon Clinton Copeland, will be keeping an eye on the chat box on the YouTube channel. So please do feel free to send any questions or any comments in this way, and these will find their way to our speakers. So the plan for tonight's event then, we're going to be here for just over an hour, and the book's author, Robert Crawford, will be in conversation with David Kinloch. And we're going to hear first from David, who will tell us a bit about the book, and then Robert is going to read for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll hear a conversation between Robert and David. And after that, we'll open proceedings to the floor for your questions. So without further ado then, let me introduce Robert Crawford, who has published 8 collections of poetry in English, the most recent of which is The Scottish Ambassador, published by Cape in 2018. He's also published several books of poetry in Scots and 4 biographies, including a biography of Robert Burns entitled The Bard in 2009 and Young Eliot in 2015, and that's the first part of an ongoing biography of T.S. Eliot. With Simon Armitage, Robert co-edited the Penguin Book of Poetry from Britain and Ireland since 1945, and with Mick Imla, he co-edited the Penguin Book of Scottish Verse. In addition, Robert has written and edited many academic books, mainly on 18th, 19th and 20th century literature. He was awarded the Saltire Scottish Book of the Year Prize, and the Scottish Research Book of the Year Prize is the recipient of a Gregory Award, and his work has been shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. Robert taught at the universities of Oxford, Glasgow and St Andrews, retiring from a chair at St Andrews in 2020. David Kinloch is Emeritus Professor of Poetry and Creative Writing at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, and his latest book of poems, In Search of Dusty Foot, was published by Carcanet in 2017. So let me hand over now, please, to David.
Thank you very much, Katharine, and thanks to you and to Boiler House Press for inviting me this evening to present Robert's fantastic new book. If I were to rise to the challenge of Robert's work, I should really be offering the little introduction that follows in the form of a stand-up comedy routine that satirizes the format of the academic book launch. I actually once witnessed a rather distinguished Scottish novelist attempt to do something very like that. The resounding silence with which the undergraduates listening received it spoke volumes. So I think I'm just going to content myself to play the fall guy to Robert's clown in what follows. I suppose the first thing to say about this book is that it is a joke. And as with many jokes, it has subversive intent behind it, but it's happy to joke about, displaying vertiginous, one of the book's favorite words, vertiginous verbal dexterity in the process. Robert's non sense relies on a huge range of savant and scurrilous puns and misspellings, as well as on intimate knowledge of literary criticism and literary theory. It's not just an in-joke, however. There are plenty, although there are, of course, plenty of those. Anybody with an interest in literature and or literary history is going to enjoy its irreverent puncturing of literary and academic solemnity. It's both irreverent and rude in all the right and in all the right on places. One of its basic premises is that there is no such thing as funny literary criticism, although it's at points to demonstrate how inadvertently funny and ridiculous much of what passes for serious criticism and theory can be. The book's both an attack on the pseudoscientific argot of modern university discourses and a plea for intentionally funny literary criticism and theory. Humour and literary criticism go together like apples and arsenic, Robert writes. And there are plenty of jokes in this book that have the juiciness of apples, and the po-faced purveyors of current literary and academic nostrums may well feel that they've swallowed phials of Socratic arsenic by the time they reach the end, if they make it that far. So, I mean, I was asked to try and set this book in context, but to do that really would be to out-preface Robert's introduction, which ever playfully makes much of the paratextual apparatus that so often bogs down weightier tomes than this. Its conclusion, to cut to the chase, seems to be that there are, in fact, slim pickings as far as context for this book is concerned. No one can name a comic literary critic, Robert states. Pope and Boswell are mentioned in passing, but the legion of honourable antecedents is quickly snuffed out by the very Scottish invention of English studies and what he calls, and I quote, the growing institutionalization of academic literary studies. And then, most galling for a critic like Robert, who is also a distinguished poet, he opines that the advent of creative writing as a subject area should have changed things for the better. It turns out, however, that academe seems to kill the comic in us all, writers, creative writers, not accepted. Creative writing, too, has perhaps been a little too keen to embrace the financial and intellectual models that underpin the academic industries. Great names are enrolled in this project of mist subversion, including one, William Shakespeare, who writes a preface to Professor Crawford's study from his base at the Old Master Building in the University of Life, Fife. When I was an undergraduate, one of the exam questions that popped up with lazy regularity asked the student to consider whether Voltaire's wit was purely destructive. In a spirit of singular generosity, however, Robert actually offers some exercises in comic criticism, or in something that hovers between comic criticism and poetry. The first of these is entitled The Struggles, and it too discovers a series of famous writers caught minimalistically in the toils of language, always to humorous effect. Here we have a series of verbal icons where the typography is as important a part of the joke as the wordplay. The effect of these one-liners, I suppose, really may depend very much on your mood when you encounter them. Some of them are sly. Some of them actually offer humorous entry into the works of the writers in question. And others are just plain daft. To me, they seem like a kind of warm-up exercise designed to prevent the literary critic from becoming too solemn. Critics and academics are scalped in this book, but so are creative writers, particularly the purveyors of how to write books, how to write guides. A little known text by the late John Buchan, 39 Steps to Writing a Bestseller, is miraculously rediscovered, its aphoristic authority in such matters intact. Each of these steps complicates the obvious and simplifies the complex in a deadpan tone worthy of Douglas Adams's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So far, so amusing. At various unexpected points, however, this part of the text transforms into a kind of prose poetry, as if mesmerized by the complete torpidity of his subject matter. Lord Tweedsmuir, aka Buchan, allows himself to be hijacked by language itself, and the result is some passages of sublime poetic nonsense. So here, I think the book is satirical, but it's also genuinely imaginative in a playful way. Nevertheless, Robert is too astute a player of academic games not to realize that such creative critical hybrids are fair game to those hunting for the cutting edge. And so to conclude, he reserves the dregs of his file of arsenic for that hero of academic grant capture, Professor Mike Foucault, author of Examine and Control, and his long-suffering graduate assistant, Kim Statz, who presents, and I quote, the evolutionary methodology of her PI's AHR BCC Big Data Impact Outreach Critical Creative Research Project. I hope I managed to get that in the right order. This project is indeed an exercise in what Professor Mike calls creaticism or critive writing. Anybody who has suffered the multiple reiterations of academic grant application or examined an ill-conceived critive PhD will grimace painfully at the barbs projected here. They cut deep, as perhaps they should. One might wonder a little bit about where the impetus for this book has come, where it's come from, and many, I think, who work in the academy will recognize some of the familiar frustrations from their everyday daily academic lives. But behind it, one senses more than just a lifetime of frustration with bureaucracy. A clue comes in a revealing paragraph of the introduction, in which Robert explains how this book fits in with some of his other recent obsessions and publications. Essentially, Robert seems to be looking for something less turgid than much of what passes for literary criticism. Something, as he says, and I quote, lighter and more mischievous. It has the brevity of aphorism, even of the SMS or the text message, which, when combined with an attention to the visual dimensions of writing, and again I quote, offers textuality a re-energized sense of play. So this book links to Robert's recent interests in what Michael Knott has called photopoetry, and it emerges out of a Scottish tradition that was itself re-energized by the graphic and concrete experiments of the poets Edwin Morgan and Ian Hamilton Finlay. Perhaps, though, there's a kind of utopian dimension to Robert's musings in this book. What's envisioned is a transformation that may still occur if creative writing is able to resist its worst instincts and genuinely help to transform critical endeavour. We may indeed be talking about hybrids here, some of which, of course, do appear from time to time in the form of excellent critical creative PhDs. That entails a genuine meeting of minds, rather than the uneasy standoff, perhaps, that sometimes occurs when English literature academics sit down with their creative writing colleagues. A meeting of minds leavened by a sense of humour, one hopes. It may be, though, that Robert is just setting the bar too high. Genuine wit is not a particularly common commodity, and if it were, maybe there wouldn't have been a need to write this book in the first place. So, to conclude, you'll smile a lot when you read this book. I found myself laughing aloud. The louder your laughter on the humour meter will probably be an indication of how deeply ensnared you actually are in the pratfalls of modern academe. So with that word pratfall ringing in our ears, I'm going to hand over to Robert and ask him to read some sections from the book.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, David. I will start off by reading a little from the introduction, preface, and prolegomenon, which, as its title suggests, is the first section of the book. And I'll just read for a wee bit more than 15 minutes. I'm not going to read all the long footnotes that accompany this section, but it's just about the first 3 pages. This is probably the most serious bit of the book, written in part to get past the series editors and make it sound more than a joke book, because it is trying to be a joke book, really. But if you're waiting for anything that might be like a joke, you could set your alarm clock for about 5 or 6 minutes, and that's how long this first section will take. Humour and literary criticism go together like apples and arsenic. Humour and creative writing, however, have danced hand in hand from Aristophanes to Old Possum and beyond. Though the tragic is so often seen as much more deserving of attention than the comic, everyone can name comic poets, novelists, and dramatists. No one can name a comic literary critic. In the institutions of the English-speaking world, as part of what has been called the Scottish invention of English literature, university classes in vernacular literature were first taught by Adam Smith, a thinker most often associated with what Thomas Carlyle later termed the dismal science of economics. At Glasgow University in the 1750s, Smith's class on rhetoric and belles lettres was not wholeheartedly dismal, and attracted some notable students, including the future biographer James Boswell. But it's hard to find any jokes in the surviving lecture notes. Smith was interested in kinds of exchange, sympathetic, verbal, and economic. For him, these were hardly laughing matters, nor were they a source of merriment for his fellow teachers of rhetoric and belles lettres, who included the Reverend Dr. Hugh Blair at the University of Edinburgh, an upstanding Kirk minister renowned for his somewhat bland, moderate sermons. Blair became the first Anglophone academic in the world to hold the title Professor of Rhetoric and Belles Lettres. His contemporary, Professor William Barron, successor to the rhetorical professor Robert Watson at the University of St Andrews, had interests in culture that encompassed not just literary culture, but also agriculture. At an ancient university, several of whose professors owned local farms, Barron wrote a book about ploughs. Hesiod and Virgil might have understood such a worldview that saw culture and ploughing as one, but it took the ploughman poet Robert Burns to connect both of those with subversive and revealing humour. The rather barren academic Baron never managed it in any of his dusty writings. While the professors of rhetoric and belles lettres lectured, their students borrowed from the university library books such as the hilarious comedies of Molière and the rollicking picaresque novels of Tobias Smollett. Probably the first significant poet to encounter rhetoric and belles lettres as a university student was the young Robert Fergusson in the 1760s, who got his revenge on his alma mater and on his teachers in his satirical Scots poem To the Principal and Professors of the University of St Andrews on their superb treat to Samuel Johnson. With comic brio, Fergusson delivers a mock lecture to the academics and is clearly embarrassed by their sycophancy to the supposed grand arbiter of English literary and linguistic taste. While no one can name a comic literary critic, it might just be possible to argue that Alexander Pope, in his essay on criticism, is the exception that proves this rule. Pope's take on criticism is characteristically and nimbly elegant, as well as still quotable. True wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. But many modern readers find even Pope's 744 lines of literary criticism and literary history de trop. For most of us, as for Polonius in Hamlet, brevity is the soul of wit. So this introduction sets out some thinking about literary studies, literary criticism, and its perennial lack of humour. And then the second section of the book that David mentioned, called Writer's Studies, is as brief as possible. David assured me that he was going to call me the Racine of the tweet in his introduction. So I'm slightly sorry that he didn't do that. But this opening section is kind of playing with very, very short texts of the sort that might be sent on phones, and really turning them into kind of cheap one-liners about writers and writing and the struggle to write. The book then moves on to this third section called How to Write a Bestseller in Just 39 Steps, for which I was extremely pleased to have a foreword by Lord Tweedsmuir, John Buchan. I'm not going to read that foreword at the moment, but I'm going to read some of the steps. I suppose you could think of this as being at the more crassly commercial end of creative writing teaching. It's a kind of mock MOOC, if you like, where someone is setting out all these steps that will enable you to write a bestseller. So I'm just going to jump in almost at random and read out some of the steps. They're very helpfully, or depending on your perspective, somewhat confusingly cross-referenced. So there'll be a wee bit of cross-referencing that will crop up. Step 2, title. Some best-selling authors have found it worthwhile to have a title. Byron, whose reputation as mad, bad, and dangerous to know indubitably added to his sales, reaped untold financial, social, and sexual benefits from being a lord. So did Lord Tennyson, who also had Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria had many titles of her own, most notably perhaps Empress of India, which helped her in her search to find an agent for her best-selling diaries. Because of the Queen's royal title, however, convention dictated that her agent had to be a secret one. Such behaviour is not generally recommended for untitled people who want to be best-selling writers, because publishers find those sorts of agents off-puttingly difficult to contact. Other titled authors include Sir Walter Scott, who bewilderingly called all his novels Waverley and often referred to himself as the Great Unknown. This was particularly difficult for his publicist, who begged Sir Walter to stick to his name, see step 1 above, and after a spectacular bankruptcy parted company with him, uttering the famous Greek words, gnothe se auton, know thyself. It is not essential to know all this in order to write a bestseller, but it may help. If you do not yet have a title, you have 2 choices: get one or refuse one. Notable authors who refused titles are Sir T.S. Eliot and Lord Tom Paine. If you already have a title, you may choose to renounce it. See under editing at step 32 below. Step 4, agents. Agents are vital for bestsellers. Ian Fleming, Lee Child, and John le Carre all have agents. Dr. Watson, however, preferred not to be bound to any particular agent, but associated himself with a more general detective agency, Holmes and Hudson. Private detectives can be very useful, especially if you are struggling to find your agent. See also under title at step 2 above. Step 8, length. Now, length is a crucial issue for any best-selling writer. Female authors and even child prodigies are often shorter than male ones, though this rule, while useful as a rough guide, is far from universally true. Before you start to write, and even just before you have begun, your typescript may look very short indeed. However, as the writing process develops, you should be confident that it will get longer, unless, of course, and this is unwise, you attempt poetry. Research suggests that over the last 2 decades, bestsellers have indeed been getting longer. Some of this may be down to improved diet, but the statistics may also have been affected disproportionately by the Harry Potter series, which began about the size of a Ford Anglia, but grew as long as a convoy of articulated trucks. Remember the incomparable Max's maxim, brevity is the soul of wit, and that modern readers avoid the Bible. If your book is still too short, shorten it. Step 10. Now, for the sake of clarity, this step has been divided into 2 baby steps. 10A, location. You can write anywhere. 10B, flats. If you do not live in a stately home but live in an apartment, i.e. what best-selling British writers frequently refer to as a flat, don't worry, you can draw on this location too for atmosphere. At the start of the most celebrated best-selling flat story, a man is skewered by a dagger in his back after arriving unannounced at a London flat and telling the occupant Richard Hannay a ridiculous story. This then leads somewhat indirectly to 39 steps, and so to this very publication that you're now reading. Writerly tip: paint your flat white. That way you will be less distracted while writing. Flat whites are favoured by stylish writers. Never, though, confuse a flat white with a white flat. Try to avoid flatness in style. And the last of these, is step 34, money. Remember that best-selling books are almost never written in order to make money. Though your publisher, your agent, and even companies such as Amazon may suggest that your best-selling book will make you incredibly rich, invariably it won't, and you should not believe them. The economics of the book trade have changed enormously over recent decades as a result of the dizzying growth in online publishing, digital marketing, bookstore closures, gravitational wave detection, and other complex factors you need not bother your head about. Soon, authors will have to pay to be allowed to write at all. At present, though, what you need in order to complete your bestseller is not some unwavering belief that your book will make money. What you need for printer's ink, keyboard batteries, food, and clothing is simply money itself. And I'll end this bit by reading something from the rather hard put upon Kim Statz's partial preface to the final part of Textual Non Sense. That's the part called Two for the Price of Two, David mentioned. It's an AHR-BCC Big Data Impact Outreach Creative Research Project directed by Principal Investigator Professor Mike Foucault. And it's prefaced by Jo Strive, but she has to dash out to a university branding meeting. And on the other side of Kim Statz's writing, there's a funder's foreword by Sir John Stallholder, who also is in a bit of a hurry. So Kim has a lot of explaining to do in quite a short space, to explain this quite complex research project, which involves poetic forms, essentially. But these forms are not so much sonnets and odes, as forms that Professor Foucault has handed out to students, and that they have been filling in as fully as they can within the time allowed. A bit like in I. Richards's practical criticism, really. Kim Statz is just explaining to readers the makeup of these forms and the different sections within them. So I'll just read her explanation of a few of the sections in these poetic forms. Name. This section gave rise to considerable misunderstanding. 14 candidates wrote William Shakespeare, 7 wrote Homer, and 1, perhaps in error, wrote Mike Foucault. Participant 764, see above, having written Ode to Autumn in the title section, also wrote Ode to Autumn in the name section. Many participants seem to have thought they were being invited to name the text in front of them, which was presented without a title, and so produced such contributions as Paradise Isle, Ode to Golf, and Arnold. Where participants appear to have written their own names in this section, these have been removed in order to preserve their strict anonymity. One participant wrote, "Why are we being asked to write our names in what Professor Foucault's book assures its readers will be a strictly anonymous exercise?" Participant 41 wrote in this section the words, "I can't remember." Date. In this section, the participant who wrote William Shakespeare wrote circa 1603. Several participants wrote, "It has proved impossible to date exactly the origins of the Odyssey." Participant 465 wrote, "I have a date allergy and so will not fill in this section," while most participants wrote the date of the day on which they were completing the form, with one participant adding, "It seems much later," and another appending the words, "April is the cruelest month." Participant 720 wrote, "Are you asking?" Participant 721 wrote, "I think I should say here and now that I am married." Participant 722 wrote, "I would not date Professor Foucault if he were the last man on earth." Participant 41 wrote in crayon, "Aye, sure." Number. This section drew from participant 653 a nuanced 15-page essay on number and meter in Caroline verse. This work is too long to reproduce here and was marked down by Professor Foucault on the grounds that the word Caroline was admissible only in the section designated name and so was wholly inadmissible under number. Several participants wrote down the longest number they could think of, and one even used a decimal point. Many participants wrote down the number in front of them on their desk. One participant wrote, "I can remember the name of T.S. Eliot's street, but not the number," which Professor Foucault thought confusing and a possible category error because of the use of the word name. Another participant wrote legion, and a further participant wrote 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, but could not remember the 12th. Participant 41 wrote, "I hae lost the will to live, and my seat at this desk is so hard that my bum is getting number and number." Address. This section prompted many participants to attempt to reproduce in the text box Robert Burns's Address to the Deil, Address of Beelzebub, Address to Edinburgh, or Address to the Unco-Good or the Rigidly Righteous, while others, perhaps interpreting the prompt more liberally, wrote out all of To a Louse, To a Mouse, or To a Haggis. Participant 379 addressed Professor Mike Foucault directly in a witty pastiche of To a Mouse, whose first line followed the original first line word for word, except that it substituted the word big for the word wee. Professor Foucault, however, insisted that this participant's work was inadmissible since the university's anti-plagiarism software had identified it as 97% unoriginal, and so it should be treated as plagiarism and excluded from the sample. I have kept it in a special drawer. Other participants chose to address a variety of world leaders, major companies, and university figures in a lively variety of occasionally questionable free-form text, which has been redacted for purpose of statistical analysis and for legal reasons. Most participants, however, wrote their own postal addresses, which cannot be quoted here for reasons of data protection legislation, but which I've also kept in a locked, password-protected drawer. In the address section, one participant wrote no trouser suit. Participant 41 wrote University of, I have redacted a word here, Alcatraz Hall of Residence. So that's just a wee flavour of some parts of the book.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. It's always difficult to drag oneself away from the charismatic figure of Professor Mike. And I'm sure that we'll come back to him maybe a little bit later in the conversation. I'd like just to kind of kick.
David, on mute. We can't hear you now.
Hello, right, can you hear me this time? I'm very sorry about that.
Yeah, sorry, didn't catch any of that. I think it was Professor Foucault hitting back.
Did you heard the initial comments about Professor Foucault? Yes.
Yes, I just didn't get the question at all.
Okay, sorry. So I wanted to take you back to the introduction. We'll come back to Professor Foucault later. And one of the kind of central worries of the book has to do with the institution, the nature of the institution, and the kind of creeping institutionalization that's overtaken English studies. And of course, this is something that you've written about in rather more serious vein when you were considering the so-called Scottish invention of English studies. So really, I suppose the Scots have got rather a lot to blame for in this context. So I suppose my question really would be, would you say that you've got a kind of love-hate relationship with the Academy? And does this stem from your identity as both a poet and a critic?
Yeah, I do have a love-hate relationship with the Academy, and I think everyone within the Academy really needs to have that. It's certainly if you're teaching a subject like literature, and it may be exacerbated if you're also a creative writer, because there is something frolicsome and frisky and fun and lively in so much imaginative writing. And yet the bureaucracy, the kind of banality of bureaucratic prose that sludges its way around within academia tends to have the impulse of snuffing that out. So I feel unless there is a sort of love-hate relationship, you can't do your job as a teacher of literature. T.S. Eliot says somewhere, institutions are necessary. And if you're going to go on teaching in a university, I think you have to believe that at some level, but you also, I think, need to find sometimes that the institution is like a necessary evil, if you like, and keep reminding yourself that literature doesn't belong to the bureaucratic side of the university and is something full of pleasure. That's not to say you're always going to be laughing out loud at it or that all literature is funny, but if you lose that sense of pleasure and pun and fun, I don't think it makes you better as a teacher. I don't think it makes you better as a writer. I don't think it makes you better as a reader.
Mm-hmm. There's actually a question that come in that seems to me to be relevant to this this particular topic from Katharine, who says the academic industry of English studies relies on relies on in part on comedy and comedies, not least those of Shakespeare. Why do you think comedy isn't allowed as a mode of response?
I'm not sure. It probably has to do partly, at least, with the institutional nature of the history of the institutional nature of the subject. You know, as I tried to signal at the beginning, I don't think we associate Adam Smith with laughter and jokes. I can't say I've come across very many of Hugh Blair's jokes. I'm not sure I've come across many of Matthew Arnold's jokes. If you want to think, you know, when the subject is getting into the Oxbridge system. People, I think, within academia, not at least feel obliged to defend their own territory by being as solemn and slightly pompously profound as they can be. That may not always be the best way to defend a subject such as English studies.
Yes, again, another question has just come in, which is, I think, linked again to this this particular topic. There's no such thing as a comic literary critic. Great premise, but isn't Eagleton a comic critic theorist? Zizek, Alistair Gray, Don Patterson on Shakespeare, David Lodge, even Kierkegaard's a bit of a joker. Perhaps then this book can liberate and enable the unlikely laughter that is the canon, that is in the canon, as well as enable new forms of critical comedy.
I've not found Terry Eagleton's work hilarious, but the introduction does mention Don Patterson and Alistair Gray, for instance, and I do, you know, I've sort of worked with both of them and read almost everything they have written, and I do think that their insights come partly from their own amazing deftness as creative writers, as well as from their humour, and probably more from those sides of them than from the fact that they happen to work within English departments. So there's something subversive. I remember hearing, in fact, I think I mentioned this in the introduction, I remember hearing Alistair Gray give these enormous sort of squeals and guffaws of laughter, so much so that I was slightly worried that, as is a danger of writing this kind of book, he was laughing more at his own jokes than anything else while teaching a creative writing class. But I could also hear the students responding to that. And I'd like to think that students will always tend to respond to humour and participate in it. It ain't exactly welcomed under exam conditions. I'm not sure I can suggest quite how it would be welcomed under exam conditions, but I think we should think a bit more about that. Like you, David, I was taught by Edwin Morgan as an undergraduate at Glasgow. And one of the things that I love about Morgan's essays is that essay, A Handful of Howlers, where he just quotes lots and lots of howlers, mistakes that students have made in writing exam papers. And it's very funny. It also makes you think about literature, even the word Shakespeare, which sort of immediately makes you think about the differences between, you know, kind of English notions of drama and French notions of drama, and why there's such a difficult relationship maybe between the two of those. my student howlers in the last section of the book are all made up. It somehow seemed more merciful than kind of transcribing lots of them. Though I did occasionally find myself, collecting things. My favourite recent one was a student who wrote that the ballad form for Wordsworth, for the young Wordsworth particularly, was the little black dress of literature. I'd written the book by that stage, but I rather wished I could have found a way to include that. You always want to steal other people's jokes. The book is written, I suppose, a wee bit in the spirit of something that Auden says in his English study, The Orators, which I've loved since I first read it in my teens. And there's a kind of one-liner in that where it says, candidates should write on the 3 sides of the paper. I always liked that.
Yeah. But I mean, the whole book really contains some fantastic examples of wordplay. And that makes me think a little bit about the French critical tradition and French literary theory. I mean, you say that there are no comic literary critics, but and that there isn't a lot of laughter in Derrida. But I would argue perhaps that in the French version of Derrida, there is a kind of sublime wit, a linguistic form of wit that's constantly at play. And that's perhaps a tradition maybe that it goes right back into the Enlightenment, to Diderot and Rousseau, and so in a sense, I suppose what I'm saying is that your own wordplay in this book actually learns from literary theory of the last 30 to 40 years at least.
My French, as you know all too well, is so execrable and non-existent that I can't quite engage with that. But I'm sure you are right. And I certainly been fascinated sometimes by the kind of forms that come out of some aspects of French theory and criticism. Derrida's Glas, for instance, that text that has a footnote that runs for the entire length of the book underneath the text. I remember being kind of wowed by that and thinking, gosh, that's rather strange, clever, and peculiar. And at the same time, I think I was reading John Ashbery's Litany, which has the poem in 2 columns that interrupt one another. I suppose both of those words share with Auden's The Orators a kind of mischievous play with form, and although it's not at all on the same level, this wee book, Textual Non Sense, is trying to play with notions of form as well as notions of forms, in Professor Foucault's sense.
And just to stay with the idea of forms and for a moment, this takes us back to what you were saying in relation to exams and all of that being somewhat serious and po-faced and so forth. Katharine asks, it would be interesting to hear how your approach to humour in writing about literature intersects with your approach to teaching, where humour is so important and enabling.
Well, I think it's important to try and make students laugh when you're lecturing to them, if only to check that they're awake. I'm finding it odd doing this, reading online like this, because Boiler House Press, the publisher, hasn't even supplied any canned laughter, and so I'm just reading into my machine, and nothing comes back. One of the pleasures about lecturing or talking or reading to a live audience is that you get, there's a bit of to and fro, and you can gauge your audience. Certainly, I think it's good when students feel they have the confidence to make a joke themselves in a seminar or a tutorial. I was worried that sometimes my students, especially as I got older, came to find me somehow too intimidating to do that. So I always liked it when they would make a joke or come up with something formally innovative. Very, very rarely happened, but very occasionally I'd get students who would hand in an essay in verse, and I loved that.
Okay, another question has just come in. Do you think that terms like humour, wit, rhetoric, and funny are just different terms some ensconced in academia, others in popular culture, reaching for the same thing?
That's an interesting question. Yes, perhaps. I don't like the idea that there should be words that only belong to one kind of discourse. And nor do I like the idea that there should be a kind of literary critical idiom that is incomprehensible to people outside the academy. So maybe sometimes the book's playing with moving words between the academy and the world outside that all of us inhabit. But sometimes we maybe forget about a wee bit when we step into the seminar room. But yes, I think probably all those words. No, I'm not sure the word rhetoric is the same as the word wit, but those words wit and humour and funny are reaching. If there were a Venn diagram, there would be some overlap between those terms.
And again, a relevant question here from Katharine. Is there something radical in the business of returning humour to literary criticism, in the sense of getting back to the root of something? What can this kind of criticism really do that cynical impact work can't?
Well, it's about love, really. It's about a love of literature. If literature doesn't make you sometimes beam and smile and have a jouissance of some sort, something's going wrong. A sense of pleasure, for me at least, is often associated with laughter. So I just like the idea of that being restored and stored within teaching, within writing generally. If you can't play with language, can you really express yourself fully in writing? You're absolutely right in saying that sense of play is there in criticism, and maybe not least in French theory and criticism of the last few decades. But I've often found that it's rather lacking in academic meetings. And I suppose the last section of the book, which when you were chatting earlier, you said was a bit darker than the others, is really just partly satirizing a kind of merciless grant-getting opportunism that sometimes seems to overcome both institutions and the institutionalized.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other kind of worries that runs through the book, the study, is the relationship between literary criticism and creative writing, between English academics and creative writers. Do you think that English studies is kind of experiencing the same struggle for dominance that English underwent with the classics at the beginning of the 20th century?
I'm not sure it's a discipline that really feels much dominance now within academia. Is the perhaps sad truth. I think academia is so driven by scientific models that English and cognate subjects are often seen by many people in universities. I'm not talking about people in arts faculties. I'm talking about universities across the board as kind of marginal add-ons. I do worry about that, but I'm not convinced that the way to defend arts subjects in English studies is to make them seem extremely scientific, though that is what a number of academics, not least in the Anglophone tradition, and from the era of I. Richards certainly did. I was always fascinated by the kind of lab-coated aspect to Richards's practical criticism book. And so I wanted to take the mickey from that a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and perhaps also, I mean, just to think about how this book fits with some of your other creative projects. One of the way out of solemnity of a kind of turgid kind of literary criticism is biography. you suggest that there are some kinds of cultural and literary history that that are also perhaps ways out of this particular bind as well. You say that we need to laugh our way out of the ghetto. And in that process also perhaps learn from the aphoristic habits of both the classics and Oriental philosophy. And these are all areas that you've worked in. You're a biographer. You've translated Latin poets. You've developed recently an interest in haiku. Could you say a little bit about how all these kind of things fit together and how they relate to some of the issues and topics of this particular book?
I'm worried I can't do that terribly articulately, but I am conscious that there's a connection between, if you like, more serious stuff that I've been doing in poetry with very, very short forms. Not just haiku, but say fragments of Simonides, which are utterly solemn and serious and funereal even. But for some of these projects using these very, very short forms, I worked with a friend of mine, photographer Norman Macbeth, and that's made me think quite a lot about what will have a visual impact and what kind of texts will go with visual material. And I suspect that's encouraged me to gravitate towards very, very, very short texts. I shouldn't say this, but at one point I sent to my agent the second section of the book, the one called Writer's Struggles. And he said, yes, that was quite interesting, and it would be interesting when I developed them into the full book. And I found myself saying, well, actually, that is the full book. So maybe these are jokes that just not everybody's going to get or like. But I like the idea of one-liners, of very, very short texts that short circuit things by their very shortness, their brevity, and might make people think occasionally in a different way, but also might just amuse them. Because my sense, I was speaking to somebody in an English department the other day who said, oh, it's just been brutal the last year. My hope is that people might enjoy being cheered up a little by a joke book. I had wanted the publisher to sticker the front of this book with a wee sticker that said official joke book of the ref, or selected as official joke book of the research essence framework or something like that. But it didn't happen. But my sense is people could maybe do with a wee bit of cheering up.
Yes. I mean, you're slightly dismissive of the section of the book called The Struggles, and you kind of characterize them simply.
I don't want to read it aloud, because if I read it aloud, it'll all be over in about 2 minutes.
Yes, but I mean, some of those, you could argue, though, do have serious intent, that one could have a serious literary conversation, as stimulated by these little verbal icons, as I referred to them earlier.
That would be nice to think so, yes.
Yeah. Okay. And can I ask you a little bit about the next section also, the where John Buchan makes a rather unexpected appearance? I mean, was it simply the kind of 39 steps joke that brought Buchan in here, or is Buchan a more significant figure in this context?
I think it was really the 39 steps joke. We're all fed up with aims and objectives, and everything has to have aims and objectives. So it was that sort of mechanical approach to literature, and taking it to the length of 39 steps seemed just in itself funny. I'd have to admit that I'm also a great fan of the 39 steps. And although I'm making fun of Lord Tweedsmuir, as British imperial figure and Governor General of Canada and canny Scot with an eye to the money, I do like the 39 Steps. So it was a way of playing. It's also a book that most people know, or at least know through the film or films thereof. So it was a kind of useful reference point just for making some jokes, really.
Yeah, but you're not a fan, I would hazard to guess, of big data humanities research. And
I mean, I've found some what you could call big data projects, like, say, the Library of Congress is chronicling America. Vast database, enormously, I'm trying to avoid using the word empowering, but enormously useful. And digital searching makes possible discoveries in biography, for instance, that were virtually impossible for earlier generations to make. So I'm not wanting to suggest in any way that ain't a good thing. But I did find myself sometimes present in these meetings where these were not meetings at my former university, I should say. They were meetings more associated with grant-giving bodies who for a time at least seemed almost scornful of the idea that you should just sit down and write a book, but instead that you should have some vast project requiring huge funding. And there is a kind of kernel within me that thinks people shouldn't be judged by the amount of funding that they bring in, but by what they actually produce, by the results. And as a writer, I'm attached to writing books. So that probably comes through in some of the jokes about this, about Professor Foucault's project. But it's more, I think, about just a kind of academic opportunism, which I suspect I will have been guilty of, like most other academics at one time or another, but which can be corrupting ultimately if taken to the extreme. And Professor Foucault, with his edge-cutting monograph and his enormous grant, which has brought him, among other things, 2 Mercedes limousines, is perhaps one of the more corrupt figures in contemporary academia.
Indeed, absolutely. I would entirely agree with you. We actually have another viewer question here, and it's the kind of question that perhaps leads one naturally to a sort of conclusion. Do you think the perspective of retirement and taking a step back from academia helped you to conceive this book? How long had it been brewing?
Well, some of the kind of resentments perhaps for some time, but resentments is perhaps too nasty a word. I wish to make some of these kind of jokes had been brewing for a long time. In fact, going back really to my student days in some ways, one of the jokes that I like, you shouldn't like your own jokes, but this one I think I am allowed to like, is one that came from our student days at Glasgow. You might maybe remember that there was a professor called Peter Butter
absolutely, yes.
at Glasgow, who's a very kind man and very generous to me, but always seemed a bit otherworldly, as if he was lecturing to a kind of luminous cloud at the back of the lecture hall. He was, the story among the students was that he was a relative of the royal family. I suspect this wasn't true, but somehow it went with a kind of slightly grand aura that he had. But the other story was that he had a son called Roland. And I just thought that was such a wonderful wee joke that on the one hand tuned into contemporary literary theory, and on the other hand sort of cut down this professor to size in a rather Glaswegian way. So my book's epigraph is, which I won't read out, but is from someone called Roland Butter. And I was pleased to be able to sneak that in. Now, I've gone on about that so much that I've forgotten exactly your line of questioning there, Professor Kinloch, so you'll need to remind me and steer me back to where I was meant to be going.
Yes, well, it wasn't actually my own question. It came from a member of the audience. Just, do you think the perspective of retirement and of taking a step back from academia has helped you to conceive?
Okay. I think there's certainly something liberating about retiring, but I did write this book some time ago before I retired. COVID and other circumstances have held it up. And I'm very grateful to you and Katharine for hosting this session. I'm really grateful to the Beyond Criticism series for being, mad enough to publish it. But like other publishers, Boiler House Press has had to wait a bit and pace itself in terms of its list. So the book ideally would have come out maybe a year or two ago. It so happens that I just couldn't wait long enough in my job. So I am now retired. I suppose it was partly the thought of retirement that made me think, oh, I could get away with this now. But I hope it's a book that will be, if not of use, in a serious finger-wagging pedagogical sense to people who are still working in academia. I hope it's a book that will just be fun for students, for their teachers, and for a wider audience who are vaguely aware of, having done a university degree or what goes on in universities, or who just like puns.
Well, Robert, the word fun is perhaps the appropriate one to end this little session on, unless, of course, there's anything that you are burning to say about the books, anything else that you're burning to say and that we haven't actually covered.
I don't think so. I'm totally against book burnings.
So
I should make that clear. Yeah.
So can I just thank you very much for the excellent reading and for the gift of this book, which has certainly made us all think, and I hope will continue to make us all laugh in the years to come. So thank you very much, and I'll just hand back to Katharine.
Thanks, David.
Thanks so much, David. Thanks very much, Robert. That was a terrific conversation. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And just before we sign off for the evening, I just wanted to remind everybody listening that if you've got a project that is somewhere on the edges between literary criticism and creative writing, maybe a project that doesn't fit into either of these camps, and that you are looking for a small independent press who might and do, keep us in mind, and you can get in touch with us via the website. So it just remains for me to thank everybody very much indeed for coming this evening, and particular thanks to David Kinloch and to our author Robert Crawford. So I'm going to say good evening and thank you. Bye for now.
Thank you.